talk about how do we want to address a lot of the racial justice issues that were going on in our country. And when we started talking about programming, actually this conversation occurred over the summer, and it was sparked by Eliza Eames, one of our presenters today. Sort of a recognition that doing 1 hour or lengthy programs, as important as they are and as substantial as they are, might not draw as many people in because it takes time to commit to that amount of time. And she came up with this idea of doing these smaller bites, if you will, these hot takes is what she ended up calling it. So we kind of ran with that idea of doing very important and complex issues, but maybe in these smaller ways that then people would know just enough about it if they wanted to go and do their own research and learn more. And so we did one on critical race theory a couple of weeks ago, and then this is our second one. Before we jump in, because we're coming from here at IUP at Indiana, Pennsylvania, and also from Indiana, the state of, we want to both acknowledge those locations with a land acknowledgement. So for here in Indiana, Pennsylvania, we recognize that we're on the unceded and ancestral homelands of the Shawnee, the Iroquois, the Allegheny, the Delaware, and the Monongahela nations. And we acknowledge the painful history of genocide and removal from this territory and honor the many diverse indigenous peoples who are still connected to this land.
And here at Ball State University, we acknowledge that we live, work, and learn on the ancestral land of the Miami, Kaskaskia, and Kiikapoi nations. And with that, I think we can get started.
All right. So thank you all so much for taking the time out of your busy Thursday afternoons to learn more about what decolonization is, and specifically through the lens of higher education. As John said, my name is Eliza Eames. I'm a second year in the SAHE program, and I'm joined by Gina Muhl, who just graduated from the SAHE program in May. So without further ado, we'd like to start by expressing that we became passionate about decolonization in higher education actually through John Mueller's equity, diversity, and inclusion class that we took last semester. Gina and I had facilitated an entire conversation on this topic, and we found that it would be pretty profound to share with other people our findings and our passions for this topic. So without further ado, let's get started on what decolonization is for higher education. I'd like to start us off with a brief historical review of how decolonization came to be in the lens of higher education. And the main element of this is the Morrill Act of 1862. Now, in the wake of the US Civil War, the US government sought to rebuild the economy through establishing state-funded institutions. With the need for both massive land quantities and funds to build these higher education institutions, the US government deemed it essential that we would take indigenous homelands, remove those individuals, and build institutions on there. So the Morrill Act of 1862 granted Congress the permission and authority to physically and violently remove indigenous peoples from their homelands in an effort to establish institutions right where they were seated. To give you all a brief visual representation of this, if you look at the screen, we have a visual image of what Indian, or as we would like to say, indigenous homelands represented in 1783. Now, all of the blue images and representation is of these homelands, these ancestral homelands. Same image, however, each red dot here now represents an institution that was founded as a result of the Morrill Act. So you can see there were a lot of indigenous homelands that had institutions founded on them, that these people then had to move or be murdered in order to give up their homeland. So as we go to the next slide, I want you to take notice of the effect of the blue size shrinking due to the Morrill Act. So the Morrill Act has now been established in 1865. And as a result, the blue is now the present or 1866 size of indigenous homelands. So as you can see, that is a huge, ginormous representation of indigenous homelands that were affected by this.
So now that we have an understanding of this land that once belonged to and does still belong to indigenous peoples in the United States, I just want to talk a little bit about how we do acknowledge these lands. So what exactly is a land acknowledgement? Land acknowledgements are something that give honor to and recognize the Indigenous people respective to the locations where we work and where we live. These serve as reminders that the land we currently occupy has long been occupied by Indigenous people who have deep linguistic, cultural, and historical connections to the land. While you all commonly see land acknowledgements in your syllabi at IUP, and that's something that I also experienced in my undergrad in Ohio, I recently found out that this isn't really a common practice at a lot of universities. For example, here at Ball State University, as I mentioned earlier, this was land that was native to the Miami, Kaskaskia, and Kikapoe nations. But when you look around at Ball State, there aren't really consistent land acknowledgements, and the information in those land acknowledgements that you might find aren't always consistent. So just know that this isn't really a common practice at a lot of universities, as I've discovered by talking to a lot of other hall directors and grad assistants and things like that. So this is something that Ball State also doesn't seem to have on like their websites related to native lands. So to educate like myself as an employee, and a few of us have done this here, we have proactively just kind of decided to research on our own and develop our own land acknowledgements, and those will be going into our syllabi for the classes that we teach next semester. So that's kind of exciting. Now looking at terms that are important to define, we're going to look first at the definition of colonialism. Colonization exists when an external group with power exerts that power and authority over another group of people. This includes like their lives, their lands, and their resources. So we all know the main form of colonization in the United States is typically settler colonization, which is a type of colonization that results in power over a group's economic power, gender, racial, and state power as well. So this resulted in the United States in like a set of hierarchical kind of structures in which Indigenous people don't really hold power. Now looking at decolonization, this is the kind of complex process of unlearning and undoing centuries of colonial ideas and infrastructures, and of also relearning how to really be together in the world differently moving forward. This is like a complex process of unlearning and undoing centuries of colonial structures, systems, and ideas, and this helps us discover how to create a new way to really exist in the world together and to bring justice to this community. It's really important to distinguish these terms because decolonization brings forward a topic that really hides in plain sight otherwise. We generally don't acknowledge the system of oppression that was put in place since the colonization of North America centuries ago. All of us reap benefits from the system that was put into place through the removal of Native Americans from these lands. And when we talk about colonialism, we typically just speak of the history necessary to really establish the nation that we all currently reap benefits from. So when we talk more about decolonization, we're really honestly exposing like the injustices that have been created to create social injustices for Native people, and we help to acknowledge that we can do more to contribute to the justice for that group.
All right, so now that we talked specifically about decolonization and how it started, let's look at it through the lens of higher education. And there are three concerns with higher education decolonization that I'd like to discuss with you all. The first being the lack of open discussion that exists in institutions of higher ed. So there is very minimal, if not any, recognition on college campuses regarding the American higher education system's foundations on colonialism. In fact, my first exposure to ever even learning about decolonization was with John Mueller's land acknowledgements that were in his syllabi, and that is with my 15 years of K through 12 and higher education experience. So with that being said, it is so imperative in our roles as both academic and student affairs professionals to address that one's ongoing life and studies and really purpose at US colleges exists on the premise of ongoing colonization. And that specifically is because people were literally removed and murdered and just violated from their homelands in order for us to attain the buildings and the recognition and the education that we have today. So having an open conversation about this is so important in our roles as student affairs professionals. The next concern that we have is tokenism. Now, for those that may not be familiar with the term, tokenism means when we are selecting one specific person to represent their entire identity. And so what happens with this in the field of Indigenous scholars for higher education is that the field of higher education does have a lot of Indigenous scholars that will advocate and research on topics. But their efforts are often tokenized, that if there's one person that really likes to talk about the history of Indigenous cultures in higher education, and they themselves identify as someone who is an Indigenous descent, people will often put them on a pedestal and say, okay, you now have to represent your entire ancestral history because you are the one that is most affected by it. And in fact, though that may seem with good intentions, that can actually make us as privileged people that do not identify in that specific group to instrumentalize and to underappreciate the efforts that they're putting forward just because we think that they should be doing all the work. So with that being said, as student affairs professionals, we cannot expect every single Indigenous peoples to do the heavy lifting and to promote decolonization all on their own. But we also cannot expect all Indigenous peoples to be the spokesperson and tokenize them on the challenges of decolonization. So although it's a tricky balance, just with us being more educated on this topic, we can help to create a further balance between tokenism and actually appreciating Indigenous scholars in our field. Lastly, with continuing oppressive practices, I think it's really important to talk about the upcoming Thanksgiving holiday. And it's imperative to note the genocide and colonization behind this holiday. For most of us, we see it as a time to gather with family and friends and eat delicious food. However, historically, that is not what Thanksgiving was. Thanksgiving was a complete murder of Native American and Indigenous peoples. And so with us, as higher education institutions, we are often given a week-long break in order to celebrate this holiday and gather with family. But by doing so, we are essentially giving into this white fantasy of Thanksgiving and ignoring the destruction that occurred to Indigenous peoples around this holiday. So it's really important to understand our role in advocating for that. So by acknowledging a university break on a holiday as Thanksgiving instead of November break, we are essentially acknowledging that Thanksgiving is a really good time to hang out with family and take a break instead of the historical root of the oppression and genocide and massacre of these individuals. And so by calling it Thanksgiving break, that is just one example of an ongoing, continuous, and oppressive practice in higher education.
So now that we know what decolonization is, what exactly can we do to contribute to decolonization as well as to decolonial justice? So really looking at decolonial justice, there are things that we can definitely do to start heading in the right direction. So racialized and Indigenous people are accused of being responsible for problems that they face due to being impoverished, displaced, exploited, or removed by racial colonial systems. This has gone on for a very long time. And simultaneously, white individuals have been conditioned to believe that minoritized groups such as Native Americans are the problem. So working toward decolonial justice really requires us all to work together, not because we want to feed into our need of feeling virtuous, but more because of a commitment to really genuinely wanting to transform an imperfect system. It also requires engaging in uncomfortable and difficult conversations whenever possible, rather than waiting for an ideal moment or idea to really talk about or engage with. We need to be okay with having conversations that don't really give us power or certainty, and rather just exploring new ideas and possibilities without being guided by like specific individuals or authorities. So like Eliza said earlier about tokenism, like we need to have these conversations without relying on someone that is Native American to guide that conversation. And we need to be willing to have these questions and really talk through them, even if we know that we're not experts, and we are not experts by any means. Another thing that we really need to do is, acknowledging the impossibility of going backwards and restoring like full justice from centuries ago. How all we can really do is move forward and do our best to really acknowledge the things that have gone wrong and helping to bring to light conversations and topics that otherwise go unnoticed. If we see inconsistencies in land acknowledgements at institutions, we need to speak up and do our own research and really take action to get this practice in place. The minimum we should do is really educate ourselves on the history of the lands on which we live and work. And then that next step is to share that knowledge with each other and with our communities. The last recommendation we have is to infuse the knowledge of this topic into like everyday conversations with your colleagues. You could also contribute to communications and programming within your institution to like educate your community on the history of the lands that we live, work, and learn on. Ask questions, participate in conversations, know that like it's okay if you're not sure of an answer, and just speak up when you notice a lack of knowledge or support for Indigenous people.
With that being said, that has concluded our Hot Takes presentation. Again, thank you all so much for taking the time to raise your own awareness on decolonization and the efforts of Indigenous peoples within higher education. We will now take the time to have a little Q&A. So if anyone has any questions or comments that they'd like to share with the group, feel free to do so.
Hi.
Hi, Mary Rose.
I'm so sorry I missed the first part, but I'd love to know your perspective on a lot of controversy has been surrounding land acknowledgements and the fact that a lot of Indigenous communities aren't involved in these conversations. So I'd love to know, for this presentation, were you able to have a consultation with any Indigenous communities surrounding Indiana?
I'll answer that for us, Gina. We did not. And I do not have any credible source to speak on this with. However, I do not know anyone within the Indiana community that represents or is of any ancestral to the Delaware, Allegheny, Monongahela, and the other Indigenous tribe that I'm forgetting right now. So the answer to that, Mary Rose, is no, I was not able, nor was Gina able to really include other people into our conversation on land acknowledgement. But I think that's a really good recommendation going forward if we were to do any further efforts on land acknowledgement and colonialism. So we'll definitely keep that in our head. So thank you,
I also think that's just like a really generally important question. Like I was talking with my own supervisor just about like, I was shocked to find out that like we don't have land acknowledgements or information about like that history around here, like on our website or anything. And when I asked why, the response was really, well, we don't have the right resources or support for those students here. So some people have found it to be discouraging and misleading to put those land acknowledgements in when we don't have resources for those students if we put those in our syllabi. So that's an interesting point, I suppose, but that's something that we want to work on here now is, talking with other departments and trying to find people either from the community that would want to speak about it or just finding more research and information from like professors that might know more and developing the resource that we would need. So yeah, your question just kind of hit on something that I've been pondering for a while now.
Thank you.
I'm curious what other people do during Thanksgiving week to honor and decolonize rather than perpetuate. Do you have
Right. Yeah.
ideas?
I think I think that's a really good question. And again, I want to clarify that there's no harm in wanting to utilize the university break as an opportunity to get together with family, to enjoy a meal, whatever that may be. However, doing so without acknowledging the history and the pain behind it and the historical relevance, I think, is where colonization kind of digs its claws in and helps to, as you say, perpetuate the stereotype. I know with my role as a graduate resident hall director here at IEP, we have a program the Thursday before Thanksgiving break, where students, we're throwing kind of like a mini Thanksgiving, where we're doing like turkey sliders with like the, you know how you make like leftover Thanksgiving sandwiches. We're doing that, but we're also showing the film Smoke Signals, which is about Indigenous peoples and their role in history. And so I think one good effort is to really educate yourself and educate the people that you care about on the relevance of the Thanksgiving holiday with colonization.
Yeah, from like a housing standpoint, I think programming is usually the answer. We do one here called Honoring Those Who Came Before, and we watch a documentary, a different one each year, just about different Indigenous tribes and where they are now, where they used to be, what the culture is that we really need to be acknowledging. From a personal perspective, my family is both European and Native American, which is weird. It's a difficult topic to navigate amongst our family. So my parents aren't super into it, but my brother and I usually read just a few articles like the night before Thanksgiving, just to make sure that like we're keeping ourselves in check a little bit and just making sure that we are well educated before just like on one day hanging out with our family and eating a lot of food, just to make sure everything is still in perspective. So that's just a personal thing, not necessarily a recommendation, but
Yeah, we read some children's books, but then I have to be careful because then at Thanksgiving meal, my kids, you know, we're educating the rest of the family, but that's not always welcome. And I'm totally willing to push the boundaries on that with adult relatives, but my kids get in the middle of it. So then I'm trying to navigate that as well. But I like the ideas for programming for students. It's good.
So Heather just commented, I noticed that my friends who are out west and who mountain bike have recently begun volunteering to pay a fee to Indigenous cultures when they hold biking events on lands that once belonged to them. So they pay a fee to the national park, but also donate the fees to Indigenous peoples. This seems like the least that could be done. Do you think that something similar could work in PA? That's a question. Yeah.
I think that's a really interesting question. When someone asked a question earlier, it made me think a lot about locations. We have a hall director here who used to work in Arizona, where there are a lot more students who identify as Native American or Indigenous. So it's easier in some capacities to do things like that in areas where there's a higher population of that. But I suppose that's a bit of an excuse because, you know, even in Indiana where we don't have many Indigenous students, well, the state or the town in Pennsylvania, that's really not a reason to not take, you know, fundraise a little bit and donate to those communities, even if it's not necessarily where you currently live, where you're donating. That might not have answered that question.
I want to thank you all for the good discussion, and I'm not ending that by any means, but I am going to go ahead and stop the recording. If anybody has to go, I know these were intended to be 15 minutes,